War is over, the economy is great, it's time to party. And spend money. The 1920s is a decade that people still can't get over. How Many Works is set in the 20s. This time period is a huge source of nostalgia because this was the first time where things started feeling modern. With the growth of mass production and modern-style advertising, some segments of the American public were ready to consume. There was a type of shameless, in-your-face luxury that hasn't really been seen since the Rococo era of the 18th century. But one of the biggest cultural signifiers of the 20s was the flapper. While the Gibson girls of the turn of the century were symbols of the new modern woman, while still following standards of traditional femininity, flappers were the girls who cut their hair short, showed their calves, were lively, confident, social butterflies who reveled in the nightlife. If people took issue with them being too unladylike, then tough. So who were the flappers? Where did they come from? What did they wear? And why did they vanish by 1930? We're going to look into the history and style of 1920s flappers. So now, let's get started. As we looked over in the previous episode of the series, the First World War ended in 1918. But then there was a new set of problems with the emergence of the Spanish flu, which concluded in April 1920. Yet, even after enduring both war and a pandemic, soldiers received very few benefits. The move back to civilian life was often difficult and uneven. However, economic prosperity and technological innovations introduced a new culture of leisure. More people started doing recreational activities. Sports were especially popular. People took selfies with photo booths. The world's first Instagram. Hollywood started flourishing, and by the later half of the 1920s, 3/4 of the American public went to the cinema weekly. In metropolitan areas, people also started going to nightclubs. They did dance crazes. Men and women were increasingly in the same public spaces. People flirted and went on dates. This was all accompanied by jazz music. This music style, coming from New Orleans, would become the defining sound of a generation, and was the first distinctly American art form. Jazz also was known for being played at speakeasies, or alcohol clubs. They were called that because patrons had to speak easy to avoid attracting attention from law enforcement. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol was illegal from 1920 to 1933. But this didn't really stop anything. People were just more sneaky about it. To enter these illegal clubs, go through the back entrance, say the password, and you're in. Though you do need to know how to run, because these places were regularly raided by police. That can be quite stressful, so it's better to enjoy art as a source of leisure. The aesthetic basis of 1920s fashion, artwork, and architecture came from Art Deco, compared to the pre-World War I Art Nouveau look of rounded, organic, natural themes. Art Deco focused on streamlined shapes, bright jewel tones, and materials such as high-end wood, chrome, or polished metals, almost resembling a factory that created the new technology people had fun with. Art Deco also drew inspiration from Cubism, which was heavily influenced by cultural art from non-Western cultures, including ancient Egypt, Mesoamerica, West and Central Africa, and Japan. If you lived in a large metropolitan, this style was virtually inescapable. It was in furniture, artwork, in magazines, architecture. You probably know of the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building. That is Art Deco. The Harlem Renaissance was a flourishing art movement, embodying everything vibrant and modern. While not defined by Art Deco, several Harlem Renaissance artists incorporated Deco-inspired geometric forms and stylized lines into their work, creating the visual equivalent of jazz music. With the rise of advertising, the Roaring Twenties also brought a culture of extravagance. It was a bit garish, but who cares? It was fun. With Ford producing affordable vehicles, cars were increasingly becoming a part of everyday life. And for some, a regular Ford wasn't enough. Luxury manufacturers like Rolls-Royce, Bugatti, Mercedes-Benz, and Cadillac catered to those who wanted their automobiles to make a statement of proud opulence. Home radios were becoming a must-have item. Instead of having to wait for the daily newspaper, the public would hear the news right as it's happening. Radio was used to provide everything, including election results, sports, music, dramas, comedies, a lot of which were horrible. Other luxurious ways of spending included jewelry, furs, modern art, and all capturing it with your personal camera. Having all these things is a lot easier than it looks. You could get anything you want with the advent of installment plans, and you can use the money for that by investing in the stock market, which 10% of Americans did. mostly using borrowed money. Buying expensive things with money that's not theirs. Nothing horribly wrong can come from this. America was buying more than ever, and as more women entered professional jobs, their growing financial independence gave them a significant role in shaping the new market. This, along with the increasing population of metropolitans, created a new archetype of women, the flapper. The term flapper originated in 16th century English, but in late 18th century Britain, flappers were used to describe an awkward but lively teenage girl. She metaphorically flapped her wings like a bird that hadn't learned to fly. The term gained further notoriety in 1920 with the silent comedy The Flapper, where a girl in a boarding school drinks soda with her crush, unchaperoned. This type of new woman was also featured in the 1922 Victor Marguerite novel Les Garçons, which focused on a woman who, after discovering her husband's infidelity, lives a free-spirited bohemian lifestyle. As flappers were portrayed in Life magazine as free butterflies, this archetype gained even further visibility in June of the same year, when Zelda Fitzgerald published an essay for Metropolitan magazine called Eulogy of the Flapper. She was married to author F. Scott Fitzgerald, and quickly became a symbol of the Jazz Age. She was famous for her partying lifestyle, extravagant fashion, and rebellious energy. She described flappers as awakening from her lethargy of dubstepism, bobbed her hair, put on her choicest pair of earrings. She flirted because it was fun to flirt, and wore a one-piece bathing suit because she had a good figure. She covered her face with powder and paint because she didn't need it, and she refused to be bored, chiefly because she wasn't boring. She was conscious that the things she did were the things she always wanted to do. Flappers would become a media obsession, where New Yorker journalist Louis Long wrote under a pseudonym as a lively metropolitan woman who regularly attended nightclubs and speakeasies. Her statement of, "I like music and informality and gaiety." Gaiety means happiness, embodied the essence of a new generation. A popular song of the time, "Oh Say Can I See You Tonight," had the lyrics, "Flappers prize style over substance, novelty over tradition, and pleasure over virtue." But something about that energy felt appealing, even trendsetting. Flappers were heavily associated with contemporary slang that was seen as inappropriate in social and work environments. Jazz didn't only refer to music, but could also be described as something fun. The cat's meow meant anything wonderful, and a cake eater was a term for a ladies' man. The flapper phenomenon was definitely exaggerated. It's safe to say that the vast majority of 1920s women weren't financially independent party girls. However, some notable women became emblematic of the flapper era, defining the spirit of the Jazz Age. Louise Brooks was a movie star known for natural, modern-style acting, far from the typical, exaggerated, melodramatic, silent movie performance. She was known for portraying lively, rebellious characters and for her signature bobbed hair. Her legacy is firmly cemented. Anyone aiming to capture 1920s glamour inevitably draws inspiration from Brooks. Josephine Baker started off as a vaudeville performer, but her career opportunities were limited in the US. She rose to fame in Paris as a dancer, known for her extravagant, high-energy performances. Her iconic banana skirt routine showcased her as an enduring symbol of the Jazz Age, though she'd later get into acting and singing in French. In the midst of Josephine Baker mania, she'd become one of the highest-paid entertainers in Europe. Her pet cheetah, Chiquita, strolling on a diamond-studded leash, made her off-screen life just as lavish and unforgettable. Baker is remembered as a contributing factor to the fantasy of 1920s Parisian nightlife. Clara Bow was arguably the most famous actress of the decade, and is known as history's first It Girl, after she starred in a stylish, Cinderella-esque movie called It. No clowns there. Director Frank Lloyd stated about her, "Beau is the personification of the ideal aristocratic flapper. Mischievous, pretty, aggressive, quick-tempered, and deeply sentimental. She wasn't especially refined like how actresses were expected to be. Girls wanted to be her, but also identified with her. There was a realness in her performances. Her vibe was youthful, quirky, and uniquely Brooklyn, where she grew up." Beau was also a huge trendsetter. Her henna red hair, invisible in black and white photos, set a trend that tripled henna sales. Beau's success showcases that flappers were luxy enough to be aspirational, but also laid back enough where they felt relatable. Today, flappers are remembered as a nostalgic symbol of the Jazz Age, but in the 1920s, there was a genuine backlash against them. Many critics saw flappers' habits of public dancing, flirting as a hobby, and what they liked to wear as a threat to social order. Flappers' penchant for slang, swearing, drinking, and especially premarital intimacy was most unorthodox. In 1922, banks across the country outright banned the flapper look. No short skirts or baring of the arms. Civic reformer Mary Foote Henderson even tried to start a movement against what she saw as vulgar fashion, or just everything stylish in the 1920s. Belle Epoque fashion designer Paul Poiret stated, "When fashion outlived its purpose, it should be relegated to the scrap heap of the flapper." Basically, flappers had no place in haute couture. They were cartoons of nice, demure Victorian women being negatively compared to the smoking, drinking harlots of the 1920s. A Harvard psychologist claimed flappers had the lowest level of intelligence and reportedly caused a hopeless problem for educators. There was a specific disdain to the bobbed hair trend. This hairstyle was banned in some professional environments, particularly school teachers and shop workers. There was even pseudoscience that women cutting their hair short will lead to baldness. There was so much effort to discourage women from cutting their hair short. Flappers were accused of trying to be masculine, when really, flapper culture wasn't about rejecting femininity at all. It was about embracing girlhood. Being an adult meant responsibilities, which can be boring, but if the economy is doing well and you have some social and financial freedom, why not have fun? The spontaneous nature of jazz culture was seen as childlike, where flappers were sometimes referred to as jazz babies. The idea of women staying as girls was a way of rebelling against what their parents and grandparents expected them to be. Bear in mind that in this era, people were expected to essentially become their parents, while jazz culture formed an ethos of individuality, joy, and playfulness. One way to display individuality was through fashion, which was a flourishing industry in the 20s. The rise of mail-order catalogs and the mass production of clothing in department stores allowed for new forms of self-expression and revolutionized shopping as a hobby. No more bargaining. You can now leisurely browse. Though controversial, flappers came to represent the height of fashion, so we're going to get into 1920s flapper style trends. Even shorter hemlines. As we mentioned in the last episode of the series, with the limitations of fabric during World War I, hemlines started getting shorter for practical reasons. The end of the war brought a sense of relief and desire to break out of limiting, restrictive wartime fashion. Shorter hemlines also stemmed from women living more physically mobile lives. With the increase of professional work, driving cars, and just moving in general, you couldn't exactly do all that with, say, a 1912 hobble skirt. The advent of shorter hemlines didn't come without controversy. The state of Utah tried to pass a legislation regarding skirt length, but none were successfully enacted. But perhaps because the style was seen as scandalous is what made wearing it so fun. Shorter hemlines marked a clear break from the past, symbolizing everything current and modern. The dropped waist silhouette. For decades and decades, women's fashion emphasized the waist. These styles, often worn with a corset, symbolized femininity and, by extension, fertility. You could say the dropped waist, or more boxy silhouette of the 20s, rebelled against the idea that womanhood was defined by childbearing. The style emphasized flapper sensibilities of girlishness and freedom over adult womanhood. Similarly to why shorter skirts became en vogue, a looser fitting top was more practical for an active lifestyle and fit current sensibilities. Anything considered stylish in the 1920s did not need a corset. If a young woman did wear one, she probably would get clowned and get asked if her grandma is dressing her. And a big reason why the dropped waist look took off is because this is about as Art Deco as fashion could get, with its focus on straight lines and geometry. Bobbed hair. Whether you like it or not, the f***ass bob was here. Again, during World War I, with women taking on jobs that men previously held, short hair was a necessity because long hair just gets in the way. But in the 1920s, having a short bob was a fashion statement. There were several contributors to the rise of short hair. One was 1910's ballroom dancer Irene Castle, and the 1920 F. Scott Fitzgerald story Bernice Bobs Her Hair, where a meek wallflower becomes a popular society girl after cutting her hair. Mary Thurman was one of the first Hollywood actresses to adopt the bob, and so did every other influential screen siren. In the 1910s, Mary Pickford was the biggest actress in Hollywood. with her trademark being her long, flowing ringlets. By the 1920s, it was all chopped off. Most hairdressers weren't skilled in cutting and styling drastic hairstyles, leading many women going to barbershops. But the popularity of the bob prompted an industry of women-owned hair salons. Though this was the most visually represented hairstyle, not all women in the 20s bobbed their hair. Sometimes for aesthetic reasons, others weren't sure if it was just a fad that would go away. But one way to emulate the flapper look was to layer and sweep up long hair so it appears short. Ultimately, the bob became more than a hairstyle. It was a way of saying, I am current and up to date with fashion. Cloche hats. This was another continuation of World War I era trends, but became even more popular in the 1920s. The cloche hat was invented in 1908 by hat designer Caroline Reboux. She was way ahead of her time. 1908 were the days of massive cartwheel hats, which often required hat pins. Cloche hats didn't need pins. You could just put them on and go. They were essentially tailor-made for the bob hairstyle. They're not the best to wear if you have really long hair, signifying its appeal to modern styles. And with its bell-shaped geometric form, these hats were also a form of Art Deco. Makeup. The 1920s opened the doors to makeup as we know it. Along with the rise of the questionable vamp archetype of the 1910s, heavy makeup flourished. Businessman and beautician Max Factor revolutionized makeup for movies, creating faces to look as expressive as possible. Since movie stars were a heavy influence for trends, and flapper characters were especially visible, bold makeup became aspirational for everyday women. Along with the portable, swivel-up lipstick tube invented in 1915, cosmetics became safer, more affordable, and easier to use, all with the help of modern advertising. Brands like Max Factor and Elizabeth Arden sold the fantasy of makeup as being contemporary and stylish. The ideal 1920s makeup included a powdered face, very thin sloped eyebrows, dark eyeshadow matched with large eyelashes to really get the doe eye effect, and typically red lipstick with a drawn-on Cupid's bow. By the end of the 1920s, hundreds of millions of makeup products were sold, though foundation shades were very limited. I'd say the rise of makeup is probably the most revolutionary trend of this time. Headbands. Bobbed hair may be modern and flapper-esque, but it can be limiting. Adding a headband brought in some variety. Headbands would be made from silk, rhinestones, have some added brooches, and in some cases, they had the function of a modern-day tiara. And remember that Art Deco took inspiration from non-Western cultures, so this trend was considered exotic. Fringe, feathers, sparkles. The 1920s may have been about rebellion, but it was foremost about glamour. No more demure Gibson Girl mellow-toned laces. Fashion in the Jazz Age was about standing out, being bold, wanting to be seen. This embrace of maximalism came from the growing nightlife and culture of celebrity influence. Fringe allows for nice flowing movements while dancing. Feathers took some motifs from typical showgirl costumes, allowing anyone who wore it to be the star of the party. And sparkles came into fashion with the so-called Egyptomania, after King Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922, while also matching jazz culture's embrace of self-expression. 1920s culture reveled in leisure, so it's only appropriate to look like a party. This bejeweled trend was so popular, it was even featured on handbags. Speaking of which, handbags. This point of time was when women started wearing purses. Of course, women always carried stuff with them, but they were kept in small, discreet carrying bags, usually the size of coin purses. But in the 1920s, shorter clothes means you don't have as much space to carry all your stuff. Handbags became an essential to have. The clutch bag was very popular, but bags were designed in a way that you had to constantly hold it. Inspired by backpacks of World War I soldiers, Coco Chanel designed the long strap shoulder bag in 1929. This design was seen as improper at the time, but it was practical. High collar coats. Not only were they nice and warm, but they matched the culture of proud luxury amongst flappers. This style also flattered the dropped waist look visually, shortening the torso and framed the face. This was a less scandalous example of contemporary fashion. However, these coats were made of real animal fur. Pearls. In past generations, pearls were symbols of ladylike refinement, exclusive to royals or the ultra-wealthy. Mikimoto discovered cultured pearls in the late 19th century, and because they were less expensive than natural pearls, they weren't only exclusive to the elites. A young middle-class working girl can casually wear pearls in daily life. In a cultural ethos of excess, who can tell her otherwise? This type of accessible chicness was also popularized by Coco Chanel, who wore layers of long flowing pearls. She even said, "A woman needs ropes and ropes of pearls." Trending pearl necklaces were long, sometimes up to 4 feet, but those were definitely layered and looped. The style was maximalist, but still relaxed, reflecting modern independence. Little black dresses. What was once a color of mourning became chic and sophisticated. In 1926, Chanel drew a picture of a simple black dress for American Vogue. Matching ideals of Art Deco, this design was straight and geometric. The movie It showcased a flapper, played by Clara Bow, putting on a black dress for a fancy event, standing out as looking more contemporary than other prim and proper attendees. If you have studied fashion history, you might have heard over and over again that Chanel invented the little black dress, and how she made the color black fashionable. That's not necessarily true. Callot and several other designers created little black dresses before 1926. It could be that initially this was more of a Parisian look, and Chanel introduced it to an American audience, but she ended up getting the glory of creating it. But because of how the color black was used in a fashion context, basically a novelty at the time, the LBD quickly caught on. The 1920s was all about innovation and making things new, so the color black was rebranded as a symbol of modern fashion. Chanel No. 5. This is not necessarily a piece of fashion, but it was an innovative perfume associated with flappers. Instead of the typical flowery scents on the market, Coco Chanel said she wanted to make the scent of a woman, complex, mature, and alluring. The scent was reminiscent of soap with jasmine, rose, mixed with sandalwood and vanilla. This perfume was marketed as something for a woman to enjoy for herself, which at the time was revolutionary. Smoking. A cigarette was one of the biggest accessories amongst flappers. In 1919, P. Lorillard Tobacco Company realized they could gain even bigger profits if they expanded their consumer base, and used chic society women smoking in their advertisements. Lucky Strike later advertised cigarettes as a way of dieting, encouraging, instead of a sweet, have a smoke. Edward Bernays, known as the father of public relations, claimed cigarettes as the torches of freedom for women. Aside from advertising, smoking was another form of rebellion against Victorian morals. It signaled body autonomy and represented community, especially in nightclub and speakeasy settings. Of course, cigarette holders were also popular with the trend of dramatic maximalism. But all of this was just marketing stuff. Do not pick up smoking, it's extremely bad. Robe de style. This was designed in the late 1920s by Jean Lanvin. This dress featured a full skirt and a slightly fitted bodice, and was an alternative to the dropped waist, chemise-style dresses that dominated 1920s fashion. This design took some inspiration from 18th century panniers, but still embodied the 20s look with a short hemline and lack of sleeves. If you think about it, the robe de style hinted at the return of structured, waist-emphasizing silhouettes for the next decade. In July 1929, the New York Times reported, "Now the siren eclipses the flapper." Who was the siren exactly? With her clothes molded to her figure, her draperies that veil line, and her curve only to accentuate them, her air of knowing much and saying little, her mysterious allure that is at once the oldest and newest of feminine accomplishments, she spells the death sentence of the flapper. It's not clear where exactly the writer, Mildred Adams, got this from. She might just be manifesting the new ideal. But she wasn't wrong with predicting the end of the flapper. As early as 1928, the Federal Reserve and economist Irving Fisher warned that the market was becoming dangerously overheated. Business theorist Roger Babson even gave a speech on September 5th, 1929, "More people are borrowing and spending today than ever in our history. Sooner or later, a crash is coming, and it may be terrific." October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, was the first major stock market crash. Panicked investors sold 13 million shares on the New York Stock Exchange. October 29 was Black Tuesday. The stock market was the lowest it has ever been. Billions in wealth were gone, almost overnight, which snowballed into bank failures, job insecurity, and a culture of spending was over, leading America into what is now known as the Great Depression. The optimism and hedonistic lifestyle of flappers became obsolete, in a time of financial crisis. The glamorous Jazz Age went from a culture of rebellion to keeping a positive attitude during hard times. And in a sense, fashion helped keep spirits high. We're going to look into the 1930s for the next episode of the series. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye!